And joining us now on the debate in New York City, Reihan Salam, lead blogger for the National Review's The Agenda. Good name. In Washington, D.C., Heather Boushey, senior economist at the Center for American Progress. In our nation's capital, Miles Korak, professor of economics at the University of Ottawa. And we welcome back author Charles Murray, also on the line from Washington, D.C. Welcome to you all. I know this is going to be provocative. Let's get underway. Heather Boushey, let's start with you. What do you think of Charles Murray's premise?
Well, I think it's interesting. I'm glad that we're talking about inequality today. However, I have some real serious reservations about both the way that he does his analysis and the conclusions that he comes to. I want to start, though, by talking about what happened before 1960. I think in some ways, in order to understand what's happened since 1960, we need to understand how we got there. You know, at the beginning of the book, Charles weaves this story, this very nostalgic, very lovely writing, in fact, about how great things were back in the early 1960s. A country that was more equal, a country that was more together, but he doesn't spend any time talking about how we got there. You know, we used to be a country that was as unequal as we are today back right before the Great Depression. And there were a lot of policy changes, a lot of things that happened in the 1930s that helped pave the way for what happened in the 1960s. You know, we did something about inequality, we regulated the financial sector, and really importantly, we provided support for workers, for their families, both when workers were at work and we gave them greater rights to unionize, but also social insurance so that when people weren't at work, couldn't work when they were retired and whatnot and unemployed, that they had benefits. And all of that helped to create the more equal society that Charles Murray talked about in the beginning of his book in the 1960s. And so as we look at what's going on today, where I would really point the finger is what's changed in terms of our economics and our social policy, and in particular, the ways that the rising inequality and the hollowing out of America's middle class have had these real impacts on economic growth and economic opportunity, especially for male workers.
Okay, I know Charles is going to want to defend his writing, but I'll get to you, Charles, but I want to get Reihan's take on this. Reihan, what do you think about Fishtown and Belmont and Charles's thesis, if we can call it that he puts forth in his book?
I'm so glad that Heather went before me because I actually found that opening section of the book not so much nostalgic. I actually found it very clear-eyed about that period in American history. I think that Charles's book emphasizes the incredible homogeneity, the incredible narrowness of American culture at the time. Most vividly for me, he describes how there was not a single American town with a Thai restaurant during this period that he's describing. So I actually think that in many ways, the world has improved markedly, and I think that Charles would acknowledge that. He's not trying to say that, oh, everything was perfect then, but rather he was saying that, look, there were some advantages in the sense of this kind of shared set of cultural norms. On the other hand, there were many ways in which American society, North American society, was much less vivid, diverse, interesting, creative, and entrepreneurial than it became. But the thing is that not all good things go together. Sometimes we have good things that come along with bad things. And I think that when you look at a lot of wage and wealth dispersion that we've had, not only in North America, but throughout the industrialized world in varying degrees, I think that it's associated with, yes, certainly many bad things. Many people have fallen to the wayside, but also with many things that I think none of us would want to give up.
Okay, Miles, weigh in here. I'm not sure if you've read Charles's book yet, but I know you're familiar with his work. So what do you think of his premise?
Well, I certainly have read Charles's book. It's a very provocative book, and he doesn't leave any stone unturned here. Everyone is, in some sense, really put over the fire. The working class, in a number of different ways, are basically called lazy or lack industriousness. At the same time, the upper class groups are called overeducated snobs, and this sort of underscores the disconnect that is becoming increasingly evident in the United States now. I think this is a very important book because it underscores that the real differences aren't ethnic differences, they're not racial differences, but they're class differences. And that's what will make this most productive. You've got a very important conservative thinker underlying the fact that there are fundamental barriers to attaining the American dream. And in some sense, while he doesn't give solutions, the description of some very important parts of community is really quite compelling as metaphor and storytelling.
So he got it right, in your opinion?
Well, he certainly got the description right, but as he says, and as the jacket of the book says, this isn't a book about causes, and therefore there aren't solutions to be found in it. But you can certainly see what Charles is thinking. There are some very provocative statements about causes and solutions, but they don't necessarily link up to the kind of description of the communities that he's outlined, Belmont and Fishtown.
Okay, Raihan, I want to parse some of Charles's premises and theses a little further. Let's talk about education. Without higher education and disappearing factory jobs, make the case for how can a lack of industriousness really be a choice for the unemployed or working poor?
Well, I don't think that's the right frame for it. For example, you've seen a marked increase in female labor force participation over this period of time that Charles is describing. But the thing is, that doesn't mean that women were not working before. What it means is that you've seen a shift from household production to market production. And similarly, you've also seen a shift among men. So for example, among college-educated, relatively affluent men, there has been a slight decrease in labor force participation in the market, whereas there's also been an increase in household production. There are two economists, Gallery and Valerie Ramey, who did some fascinating work on how among the college-educated middle class in the United States, you've seen a marked increase in the time devoted to childcare. And part of that is because there's a perception among people who belong to that group that human capital is very valuable, that you want to cultivate human capital by co-producing human capital with your children. So the thing is that the big thing that I like the most about Charles's book is that it tries to use some of these numbers and hard indicators to kind of reveal that a purely material perspective is only telling us part of the story, that actually these normative transformations and this normative divergence in American society is a really big deal. There are people who can earn more income if they want to, but who choose not to focus on maximizing income because they want to invest in leisure or cultural capital or any number of things. That happens for the affluent. That also happens for the less affluent. But the pattern of what one does with that leisure time varies pretty significantly from group to group, and that's what's interesting. Okay,
Charles, what do you make of what you've been hearing?
Well, first, Miles is my ideal reader. I don't know what his own political standing is. I would suspect maybe it's left of center, but I really wanted to write a book that people on the left could read without throwing against the wall. And so there are no cheap shots in there against the left, I don't think. And in fact, I maintain a silence on causes because I want to engage people in a conversation across the political divide about the nature of the problem. That's one thing I take away from it. Another thing, because I'm beginning to sound too nice at this point, so I will now fit the caricature. In Fishtown, I have a chapter about the real Fishtown in Philadelphia, taken from a wonderful PhD thesis by a doctorate who lived in Fishtown and simply recorded in an anthropological fashion what she was watching. And the fact is that you go talk to women in Fishtown, and they are not going to say, gee, these poor guys, they're out there looking for jobs all the time. They just can't find them. No. What you hear is about a lot of guys who, in fact, are living off their girlfriends, are living off their sisters or other relatives, who don't want to work. They exist. Now, let me back off for a second and say, is this everybody? No, it's not. It's a minority among a lot of other very hardworking people. But when you see an industry which has developed in the United States teaching you how to qualify for disability, how to get through the disability qualification process, even though you aren't really disabled, something has gone on in the culture that is worth noticing.
Okay, Heather, Charles makes the argument that the divide is cultural, not only economics. Do you agree with that?
Well, certainly there is a cultural divide, and he does a good job of laying out what he thinks that cultural divide is. I want to actually start, though, by talking about one thing that Charles just ended with about disability. I think that one of the things that the viewers of the show might be interested to know is that in the United States, the number of people on disability by gender have grown in tandem. So this is not just a guy story. It's not just those men that he talks about in Fishtown that don't want to work, that are going on disability, but there's been an increase for both men and women. And I think in the book, it would have been really fantastic if he'd spent more time actually digging into why people are going on disability rather than making assumptions that because men aren't lifting such heavy things, they aren't disabled. I would point to, certainly we've seen a decrease in the kinds of labor law enforcement and of course a decrease in unions in the United States, all of which have an effect on worker safety and health outcomes. And of course the challenges the United States continues to face with health insurance coverage, all of which are tied up in these questions of disability. But it is not true that this is just a male problem. So I think that one of the challenges in some of these arguments about whether or not it's cultural or economic, a lot of the cultural reasons seem to be tied up in some ways with gender, not all, of course, but there is some feed through with that about these men not working. Yet much of the economic story, when we look at why men aren't working and what's been happening to the U.S. economy and the destruction of U.S. manufacturing jobs, it's now been going on for generations. I think that that's a really important place to start this conversation, understanding what kinds of opportunities are out there. I'll end by saying, in some research that I've conducted with a colleague of mine, John Schmidt, and we found that 1 in 5 men who get a college degree actually earn less than the typical high school graduate. So this, alongside the fact that we know that there's been this long-term trend away from, towards lower wages for men at the bottom half of the wage distribution, if not higher up, really does point to a real profound and fundamental economic challenge. And there's a lot of great research that then talks about the implications of that for marriageability and how that plays out in terms of communities.
Okay, Heather, you're going to have to write that book because Charles has said very publicly that this is his last book. But I want to go to Miles. Miles, tell me, is Charles right? Does the cultural divide sort of supersede the economic divide?
Well, as I said, Charles tries to make it clear that he doesn't want to approach solutions. But frankly, there is a subtext in the book, and you just heard him mention it. There's an elephant in the room, and that's the welfare state. And in particular, he contrasts the European welfare state with the American. And from what I can seem to glean from the book is that public policy has caused these changes. I think it's much deeper and more fundamental than that, and in fact, probably part of the problem is that there isn't enough good public policy as opposed to there being a public policy that causes people to go on disability payments, for example. In America, there are 3 types of inequality, and this also affects Canadians. There's the inequality that Charles documents at the lower end, the inequality that in a previous generation was held in check by good, solid manufacturing jobs that were unionized with a reasonable minimum wage. Those people have been hit hard by globalization and technical change, and there's been a need for big changes. And some of the people who've suffered the most, indeed, are young men. Their vision of themselves has to change as they move, or as this generation moves from manufacturing and producing to servicing. The second type of inequality that Charles focuses on, and that's important also for Canadians, is what's happening at the upper end. Those with a good education, a good solid education from one of the best schools in the US earns you a good deal of money, allows you to marry someone just like you, and allows you to build gates around your community. That also comes from all of the technical changes that we've experienced in the last 20 years. The economics is driving that. And the third inequality that is really important, and that's a bit understated in the book, but does come up towards the end, is what's happening at the very top. The top 1% in the United States, the 1 out of 100, earn over 15% of all of the country's earnings. They've grabbed all of the productivity gains over the last 20 or 30 years. And that's a place in which there is a need for a cultural explanation. How is it that it's now acceptable for CEOs to be making so much more than the average worker? And those people, through their financial well-being, have a lot more political voice. They've changed the rules of the game, and that's caused the situation to be even more difficult for others. So while Charles describes all of these outcomes that are important, sense of work ethic, criminality, marriage, and religion, they're outcomes, and they reflect these underlying realities of growing inequality. And the fact that the welfare state in the U.S. hasn't buffered and hasn't supported the lower groups, I think is as much the problem. And Charles seems to think that is what's causing the outcomes he wants. It's that the net, the fabric of the safety net is a lot thinner than it should have been in the U.S.
Charles, is this a made in America only problem?
Well, there's an aspect of it which is American, which is that the civic culture that we were so proud of and that was so characteristically American, if that's unraveling, that's unlike the experience in Europe. I mean, Europe, don't want to spend a lot of time on this. There are a lot of good things about day-to-day life in Europe that I don't deny. It's different from the United States. The substructure of the culture has been different, and I don't think you can grade the changes on the same metric, as it were, Europe and the United States. Just want to make this one observation. The last chapter, I openly say, okay, now I'm going to tell you my view of the situation with regard to causes and what might be done. But I open part 3 of the book, that last part, by saying, some of you can have come to this page convinced that I have given you a compelling reason that the United States should become a social democratic state like Europe. Others of you can think I've made a compelling case for conservative social policies on marriage and work. And I'm a libertarian, and I think that we need to move back to a limited government. But I say very openly, these data can be interpreted in terms of solutions in many different ways.
Okay, Raihan, you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Just one observation that struck me as interesting with regard to disability, a subject that both Charles and Heather Boucher had raised earlier on. Between 1987 and 2007, we went from 1.25 million workers between age 18 and 65 who were disabled by mental illness to 4 million, a quite striking change, so that now of 1 in 45 Americans who are in the working age population suffer from disabling mental illness. Now, 1987 and 2007 are, of course, markedly different in all kinds of ways, but the forces that we tend to think of as giving rise to mental illness, like modernization and broad changes in family structure, et cetera, those things didn't necessarily change all that dramatically over that 20-year interval, and that's been a huge driver in the increase in the number of people on disability. Now, you could say, well, that's because of things that have defined life for working-age Americans, but among children, the number of people who are severely mentally ill has increased by 35-fold over the same period of time. Now, I would argue that some of the issues that Charles raises in terms of these dramatic changes in family structure contribute to this environment, in part because when you see traditional societies elsewhere in the world, for example, in Northern Europe, where you have more children raised with both biological parents, in Sweden, France, and Germany, 2/3 of 15-year-olds live with both biological parents as opposed to half in the United States. Those things might contribute to this larger climate, but these are things that don't necessarily relate directly to what we think of as working life. And with regard to Miles's observations, and he made many very interesting and important ones, one thing to keep in mind is that when you look at the productivity gains that we've achieved in not only the United States, but in many of the advanced market democracies over the last few decades, many of them have been heavily concentrated in what we describe as knowledge-intensive service industries. And these are domains in which productivity is increased partly because of better sorting. That is, you have firms in which pretty much all of the employees are high human capital individuals, and that has actually led to these kind of considerable increases that are team spillovers, you might say. The spillovers from productivity among people who are all themselves high productivity individuals, rather than more heterogeneous firms. So that is one reason why some of those gains have been captured by people, particularly due to a rise in performance-based compensation, a subject that the UBC economist Thomas Lemieux has covered among many others. So there are a lot of different ways to look at this picture, and I fear that strengthening the safety net, which may well be valuable in some respects, I fear that that's not actually going to be as much of a solution as Professor Korek might think.
Okay, I want to change gears a little bit and just talk a little bit about one of the things that Charles brings up in his book, and that's about religion. And I want to read something that Charles wrote, I think just a few weeks ago, actually, in the Wall Street Journal. Here's what Charles Murray wrote. Whatever your personal religious views, you need to realize that about half of American philanthropy, volunteering, and associational memberships is directly church-related, and that religious Americans also account for much more non-religious social capital than their secular neighbors. Charles, you set this up. I mean, we're in a time where people, you know, religion's a tricky thing at any time, but religion is particularly tricky in this day and age. You're putting forth a pretty, I don't even know how to say it. I mean, you're basically saying you go to church, you're a better person than someone who doesn't because you invest in social capital. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm really being just completely empirical here. I guess full disclosure, I'm an agnostic myself. Robert Putnam not a right-wing ideologue, is the source of those numbers. These numbers are not really arguable. It just is the case that if you're talking about these kinds of activities, religion accounts for that proportion of them, and religious people are also much more active in their communities than non-religious. That's the fact. Now, of course, that does not mean that to be a good person you have to be religious. It's speaking to a reality of American culture that has changed, and with that comes profound implications for the future of that culture.
Heather, how important is social capital to economic well-being as you see it?
Well, there's a variety of ways that social capital, of course, is important. One of the themes that we've been talking about in this conversation so far that also ties a little bit to religion is the important the important community and family effects around raising children, raising the next generation of workers that are going to hopefully be the productive members of your future workforce. And one thing I was thinking about as Charles was just talking about the religion question, of course, is that a quarter of children who are in childcare in this country are in some sort of faith-based childcare. So certainly the people of faith play a very important role in helping to nurture that next generation. But one of the challenges in our new economy, of course, is that over the same time period that Charles's book is, we've seen this movement of women out of the home and into the workplace, which has had real implications for what capacity families have to contribute to social capital. So it used to be the case, of course, that the typical family had a stay-at-home mother who could provide those kinds of community services. She was the one who was volunteering for the League of Women Voters. She could take care of the ailing neighbor, as well as taking care of the children and helping the family in a variety of ways. Without that, typically with two earner families working such long hours when they both have jobs that are in sort of the middle and upper classes, what you see is less capacity for families to do that kind of volunteerism and connect with their community, which of course has implications for communities, but also for the development of children as well. One theme that we haven't touched on yet is that, as we've seen the economy change and as we're sort of having this conversation about culture, we haven't spent enough time in our society thinking about who's raising the next generation of children and whether or not we're actually providing families with the kinds of support that they need to be both good workers and good parents. The United States is very much an outlier in terms of providing benefits like maternity and paternity leave, which are available in other developed countries but are not, and we don't have paid maternity and paternity leave here in the United States, except for in New Jersey and the state of California. We don't have the right for many workers to take a day of paid sick day. So all of these things really do contribute to many of these cultural questions and the ability of families to be healthy parts of their community.
All right, I want to bring up a graphic that we showed at the first part of our conversation with Charles. And this again, because I know none of you can see it, is about the divide, the labor divide. And the Fishtown numbers have changed drastically from the period from 1960 to 2010. And the Belmont's changed a little bit, but not obviously as drastically. We often hear of a disappearing middle class, but that's not really the case. And I want to begin with Miles by asking you, how do you bring the fictional Fishtown people, the Fishtownians, I don't even know what they're called, how do you bring them up to that level?
Well, that's a very, very good question. I think that's the heart of the public policy issue for these people. A prominent Harvard labor economist, Lawrence Katz, has argued that we have to think of developing a service sector that is more high-skilled or artisanal, if you will, so that services move up the value chain. One of the important things about Charles's book, or at least one of the subtexts, is that we shouldn't be advocating government policy for the sake of doing that. We have to make a case that it's effective. There are some things we can change and some things we can't. And what's happened to people who live in a place like Fishtown, the root causes we can't change. President Obama has certainly been talking recently about sort of reinvigorating the manufacturing base, but I think many young generations of young men are going to have to face the fact that we live in a service economy and it's much lower paid than it otherwise was for their fathers. Part of that is getting more education. I'm sorry? Part of that is certainly getting more education.
When you're done, I want to say something.
Okay, you finish your point, Miles, and then we'll get Charles in here.
Okay, part of that is certainly getting more education and making sure that education is accessible and high quality from the very early years in life. I'll let the others jump in.
Okay, Charles, you go ahead.
Well, I wanted to piggyback on something that Miles said when he talked about Katz's idea of having more artisanal jobs, more higher skilled service jobs. Being on an assembly line is one of the most boring jobs in the world.
Have you done
the loss
it?
of all those manufacturing jobs. Have I? No, I haven't.
Okay.
I have lots of friends who have, and they assure me it's one of the most boring jobs in the world. If you have a job where you're actually exercising a skill, whether it's cabinet making or plumbing or whatever, you're actually spending your day solving problems, sometimes creating things of beauty. You're spending your day in ways that are very satisfying. And so that is a strategy to shift the workforce and say, you know what, there are people who pay a lot of money per hour, $30, $35 an hour, for example, for people who can landscape, for people who have special skills and crafts in terms of things that go on with renovations of homes. There is money out there to be made, and also more satisfying lives with a shift in the nature of the jobs and the kind of thing that Miles referred to, rethinking the skill levels of some of these service jobs, is, in my view, one of the few promising, optimistic, hopeful possibilities for the future.
Miles, let me reduce this to the schoolyard and throw this one out at you. If there's so much inequality, why doesn't the majority just gang up on the minority?
Well, I think that's a very important question, and I think the implications of this book for that question are probably the most important implications of this book. That's a puzzle that social scientists have had. If the minority are making so much more, why doesn't the majority vote them out of power and rechange the rules of the game? Historically, that didn't happen in the United States because the poor were divided. There was a type of divide and conquer strategy, if you will, implicitly. They were divided along ethnic lines and race lines. What this book is saying, and this is why I think focusing on white America is a stroke of genius, if you will, is that all of the people in the lower middle have a good deal in common, that there is potentially a coalition there. You've got a respected conservative thinker saying that the racial divisions, the ethnic divisions in society aren't the real ones. It's these class divisions that have to do with access to higher education, with coming from a better family. And part of the reason also for this inequality is sort of the rules of the game in terms of regulations and tax strategies. So I suspect, or I would expect, that this book will engender that kind of conversation and perhaps lead to a much broader coalition.
Charles, I want to talk about one more thing that I found really striking in your book, and it's not only how we live, but where we live. And so I want to talk a little bit about this amongst all four of you. But Charles, just set the scene of what you say in your book about where we are choosing to live, the new upper class versus the people in Fishtown. By the way, what do you call those Fishtown people?
You know, I've never figured that out.
Okay.
I call them Fishtowners.
Okay, well, I call them Fishtownians, but doesn't matter.
With regard to the new upper class, you have in the United States increasingly large enclaves of zip codes that are very wealthy and also very highly educated. Just a quick pair of numbers to convey how much this has changed. The North Shore of Chicago has been an elite neighborhood for the last 100 years, probably. In 1960, though, in those elite North Shore neighborhoods, median income was $84,000. And that's in 2010 dollars. That's not affluent. Only 20-odd% of the people in those neighborhoods had college degrees. So even though those were the elite neighborhoods, the culture was very similar to elsewhere in the country, because most of the people in that neighborhood had made their money in that generation, and they brought to their adulthood all the memories of their childhoods. Now we have large numbers of enclaves where not only do people only associate with others who are as successful as themselves, their kids, the second generation, has never known any other life than that. And there has also been a distinctive culture develop among the new upper class that is different in all sorts of dimensions from the culture of the rest of America.
Just tell me briefly how so, yeah.
Yeah, everything from the food they eat to the child rearing techniques they use, the age they get married, the amount they watch television. Here's an example. The average American watches 35 hours of television a week. The average member of the new upper class, as far as I can tell, likes to brag that they don't even have a television anymore, or if they have one, they use it to watch Masterpiece Theater. There is a cutoff from a great deal of what goes on in the rest of America in these enclaves. And anyone who has been part of one of those enclaves, when I talk about a distinctive culture, knows exactly what I mean.
Heather Boucher, we see it here in Toronto, and we all live in big cities in America and Canada. You know, diversity in neighborhoods is dwindling. There's no sort of real debate about that. But I guess the question then becomes, do mixed neighborhoods really work?
Well, there's certainly a lot of, that goes back to the Jane Jacobs idea about, both mixed-use neighborhoods and lots of people coming together in communities. Certainly in the United States, we have a long history of segregated neighborhoods and neighborhoods segregated, especially by class, as Charles has talked about. I think that is one of the very interesting pieces. I did very much enjoy reading those sections and pointing to Massey's work on that here in the United States. Certainly one of the things that we've seen here in the U.S. is this very top elite pulling further and further apart. And Charles documents, it has a bunch of data showing how they've congregated in a few cities and are, further apart culturally, but also further apart spatially. They're going to the same schools. And, one of the things that we've seen over the past couple of decades is as families, especially in the middle and upper middle class, have had a harder and harder time keeping up as the very top echelons have pulled apart, you've seen this upward, this anteing up of, making sure that your kids get into the right school, which means you have to buy the right house in the school district that can, get that kid into that school, which then bids up the prices for a lot of the things that, especially homes, and we've just lived through this enormous housing bubble here in the United States, that especially happened at the top end as families were bidding up these prices. And might I add, there were the financial instruments available for people to take on the debt to make those purchases happen. So you saw a lot of families stretching, and certainly we've seen an impact of that. And what I'm trying to do here is sort of pull the conversation a little bit back to some of the downsides to this very severe high inequality we've had in the United States in terms of the overall economy. And I think that that's one of the, as we're looking at what's happened to neighborhoods, and we think about especially what's happened to the U.S. housing market and the enormous impact of the collapse on our economy and the devastating impact for millions of American families, this kind of high inequality that Charles so clearly articulates in his book, I think is both a profound source of the problem in the devastation of our economy.
Raihan, weigh in here. What do you make of this idea of where we live?
I unfortunately have a lot to say here.
Okay, go ahead. I'll cut you off when you've said enough.
So one finding, Edward Glaser and Jacob Vigdor recently published a study looking at segregation over the last decade, and what they found is that racial segregation over the last decade has decreased while class segregation has increased to some degree. So that's kind of both positive news and perhaps negative news. With regard to this spatial separation, I think the way to think about it is in terms of markets. So many people who are less skilled tend to work in, for example, household production, the outsourcing of household production, so in restaurant jobs and other service work. And so in a way, there are complements for people who are high productivity, high skilled workers. And the problem is that when you don't have very good connectivity, very good transit modes, very good other modes of transportation between those two populations, then it actually isolates many less skilled workers from potential employment opportunities. So that's one reason why when you're talking about the spatial separation, one thing you need to look at is zoning laws. One thing you need to look at is restrictions on density in many of these high productivity regions. If you were to address some of those things, you might actually mitigate these problems considerably. Now, that doesn't mean that actually means in a way that you have more inequality within a particular city, for example. One of the reasons why New York City is a magnet for poor, less skilled workers is because they have a market for the services that they can provide. And so, the fact that you have that inequality isn't necessarily a bad thing in the sense of providing opportunities for absolute upward mobility for a lot of those poorer workers. And one observation that Charles had made earlier on was particularly intriguing to me with regard to television. When we talk about social capital in the context of religious belief and much else, one fascinating development of recent years has been the emergence of what some are calling peak TV. That is, it seems that we've actually peaked the number of hours that people were watching television. In the year in 2011, between Q3 and Q4, people between the ages of 18 and 30 actually saw a decrease in hours of television watched, whereas people are now more inclined to use active participatory technologies, to consume entertainment and do much else. This could actually be an indication that our culture is becoming more engaged and that there might actually be a revival of the kind of social capital that Charles is describing with regard to religion. So I think that actually some of the indicators look very positive.
Miles, I just want to turn this back to Canada, because Raihan just mentioned the words upwardly mobile, and you argue that it is somewhat easier in this country to be upwardly mobile than in the U.S. Why is that?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the defining metaphor of the United States is this notion of the American dream. And Americans understand that to mean that you're free to do whatever you like, to choose whatever you like to see, to get ahead in spite of your family background. It's energies and talents that are rewarded. And it actually turns out, when you look at the data, that family background is much more tightly related in the United States to the adult outcomes of children than it is in Canada. Part of the reason for that has to do with differences at the two extremes. In the US, if you're born to a low-income family, you're much more likely to stay low income in Canada. And similarly, if you're born to a high-income family, you're much more likely to grow up to be a high-income adult than in Canada. And there are many reasons for that. They have to do, certainly as Charles has underscored, the fundamental role of the family in a child's life. The family is under a lot more stress in the United States than it is in Canada. He's documented clearly the high incidence of single parenthood, time stress in those families. It's not as severe in Canada. But it's not just families also, it's how they interact with labor markets and public policy. And the most important public policy, dimension of public policy that I'd like to stress in this regard, and Heather briefly mentioned it, is the education system. So in the US, a lot of the financing for primary and secondary schools is very locally based on a narrow tax base. So you get some very high quality schools, but other neighborhoods have very poor quality schools as a result. Financing is broader in Canada. So for example, school boards did not have to cut back during this recession like many states had to. And the quality is more evenly distributed. So families are under less stress. There's, and there's more sort of social investments in terms of the health care provided and the education provided in the early years. But there's no single answer to that question.
Okay,
but it is interesting. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Canadian parents spend affluent Canadian parents actually spend less time on childcare than affluent American parents. So that's another interesting divergence between the two countries.
Okay, folks, thank you for this. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all four of you for joining me today from across America and from our nation's capital. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.